Elizabeth Morgan watched the rainy landscape through the window as she checked her flight confirmation email one more time on her computer screen. Her slender fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, verifying that every detail was correct. As an accountant by profession, she was meticulous with numbers. "Everything's fine," she whispered to herself, tucking a strand of her long black hair behind her ear as she stood up from her chair. The living room walls were decorated with numerous family photographs. Perhaps only Elizabeth knew the complex emotions hidden behind those smiles. Since childhood, she had been the family organizer. Her mother, Diane, despite being a teacher, was surprisingly irresponsible when it came to domestic matters. She was always obsessed with maintaining her youth and prioritized her own desires above all else. Most evident was her blatant favoritism towards Elizabeth's sister, Amanda. "Elizabeth, how are the preparations for the trip to Europe coming along?" her father, Robert, asked in a quiet voice as he entered the room. He had recently retired after a stable career as a banker. Behind his serene expression, there always seemed to be a tinge of regret and resignation. Elizabeth felt a knot in her chest every time she saw her father, who had almost no voice or vote in family matters, always overshadowed by his wife's strong personality. "Yes, everything is fine. I booked the hotel in Paris and organized the local tours," Elizabeth replied with a smile. As with other family trips she had planned, she took care of making the reservations and paying for most of the trip to Europe. It had become her role. "Well, how nice. You're always so detail-oriented," said Diane's voice from the kitchen. She appeared with a glass of wine in her hand and looked Elizabeth up and down. "But don't you think you should buy more modern clothes? We're talking about Europe, Elizabeth. Your style is going to make you stand out in the photos next to Amanda and the others." Elizabeth just smiled silently. Years of experience had taught her that arguing was pointless. "Mom, where did we leave the suitcases?" Amanda's cheerful voice was heard from the entrance. She worked at a marketing company and was a fashionista who was always aware of the latest trends. Her husband, James, was by her side, holding a large suitcase. "Oh, Amanda, James. What perfect timing!" exclaimed Diane. "Elizabeth was just saying she's finished with all the preparations." Diane rushed towards her daughter and son-in-law, hugging Amanda enthusiastically. She also smiled kindly at James, an ambitious man who was making a name for himself in the real estate sector, and her clear favorite. "Thank you as always. Without you, this family trip wouldn't have been possible," Amanda said cheerfully. Although her eyes did not reflect true gratitude, Elizabeth noticed this but, as usual, responded kindly. "You're welcome. The most important thing is that we can have a good time together as a family." "Elizabeth is a good girl," Robert commented, then added in a softer tone. "But maybe you should think about yourself from time to time. You're always focused on the family." "Robert," Diane interrupted. "Elizabeth is just fulfilling her role. Besides, she's still single, so helping us should be her joy, right?" Elizabeth gave her father a slight smile and headed to her room. Outside, the rain was intensifying. She took a deep breath to calm her emotions. It was the same old story. Her efforts were taken for granted, while even Amanda's smallest contribution was endlessly praised. Still, she loved her family, which is why she had organized the perfect trip once again. The next morning, Elizabeth woke up early to make the final preparations. She checked passports, printed booking confirmations, and prepared envelopes with exchanged euros for everyone. Her suitcase was smaller and simpler than the others. "Everyone, it's time to go," Robert shouted from the living room. He appeared first, followed by Amanda and James, holding hands. Finally, Diane made her entrance with impeccable makeup and a sophisticated travel outfit. "Now our European adventure begins," she exclaimed excitedly. Elizabeth smiled silently. Atlanta International Airport was bustling with morning activity. The departure area was overflowing with travelers from all over the world, and different languages filled the air. Elizabeth led her family to the check-in area, holding a folder with documents in both hands and with a serene expression. "Flight to Paris," she told the airline employee. "Reservation for the Morgan family." "Yes, one moment, please," the young woman replied as she typed quickly. "Miss Morgan, the reservation is for 5 people, correct?" Elizabeth nodded. The employee frowned slightly as she looked at the screen. "Please wait a moment." She began checking another screen. Diane sighed impatiently and tapped Elizabeth on the shoulder. Is there a problem? We don't have much time. The employee is checking, Elizabeth replied calmly. Behind them, Amanda and James were talking in low voices, laughing occasionally. Robert waited silently. I'm sorry, the employee finally said. I can confirm the reservations for Diane, Robert, Amanda, and James. She paused and looked uncomfortably at Elizabeth. But it seems there is no reservation for you. Elizabeth frowned, confused. That's strange. I made reservations for everyone. She took out her phone to open the confirmation email. But before she could, Diane stepped forward. I'm sorry, she said calmly. We didn't actually make a reservation for her. Elizabeth stared at her mother, bewildered. What are you talking about? I made the reservations for everyone. Diane shrugged and looked at her coldly. Of course, you only booked for the family members. Elizabeth was speechless. She felt as if all the sounds around her faded away. Amanda stepped forward with a giggle. Maybe you could catch up with us on a cheap bus. Although Paris is quite far, she said, exchanging a glance with James before letting out a laugh. Robert opened his mouth to speak, but Diane's sharp look silenced him instantly. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet his daughter's eyes. In Elizabeth's mind, the events of the past few weeks flashed like a sequence of images. The plane tickets she had booked, the itinerary she planned, the hotel she organized, and how her mother had said, I'll do the final check, before asking for her password. Everything connected. I understand, Elizabeth finally said, with surprising calmness in her voice. I hope you have a good trip. Elizabeth, Diane began, but Elizabeth had already turned around. It's okay, Mom. It seems my role has ended here. Without rushing, Elizabeth walked away from the check-in area and disappeared into the crowd. Behind her, Diane was giving instructions to Amanda and James, while Robert kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Elizabeth found a cafe inside the airport and sat by the window. Outside, planes were taking off one after another. She ordered a coffee and took out her phone while she waited. When the waitress brought her hot drink, she smiled slightly. Thank you. She took a sip. The warm liquid went down her throat, slightly calming the tightness in her chest. She took her laptop out of her bag and turned it on. When the screen glowed, she logged into the travel agency's website. There they were, all the family reservations registered in her account. Diane had logged in and simply removed her name. Just as I imagined, she whispered. She checked the hotel information. Luxurious accommodation in Paris, then a stay in Rome and finally in London. All hotels were booked in her name, as were the tours and restaurant reservations. No one in her family knew, but she had been in charge of every detail of the trip. A new message arrived on her phone. It was from Amanda. I'm sorry, but Mom says you always try to control us, so you needed to learn a lesson. We'll talk properly when we get back next week. Elizabeth finished reading the message and set it aside. She stared out the window for a long time. Finally, she took a deep breath and turned her attention back to the computer. I'm not the one who needs a lesson. She logged back into the travel agency's website and opened the booking information. Her fingers moved precisely over the keyboard, executing various actions on the screen. This is the price for leaving me behind. Hours later, Elizabeth had moved to another cafe. From there, she had a direct view of the international departure gates. She checked the time. By now, her family's flight should already be flying over the Atlantic. Would you like another refill, ma'am? The waitress asked. Thank you, but I'm fine, Elizabeth replied with a smile. I'm heading to my next destination. She closed her computer and put it in her bag. A new flight confirmation email had just arrived on her phone. The destination was not Paris. Elizabeth stood up silently and left the airport. Charles de Gaulle International Airport was illuminated by the morning light in Paris. In the arrivals area, Europe's largest airport bustled with the comings and goings of travelers from all over the world, with multiple languages floating in the air. Diane Morgan, with the weariness of the 11-hour flight reflected on her face, placed a hand on Amanda's shoulder. Finally, we've arrived. Feel that wonderful Parisian air. Amanda took out a mirror and smiled as she adjusted her hair, disheveled from the long journey. This hotel is 5-star, right? I think it's the best one Elizabeth booked. James, without taking his eyes off his phone, replied, "The transport should be waiting for us in the arrivals area." That's what Elizabeth's email said. Robert walked behind the family, dragging his luggage. In his eyes there was not only tiredness but also an inexplicable guilt. "She must be angry," he murmured. Diane turned to her husband and narrowed her eyes. "Are you still thinking about that, Robert? We did the right thing. Elizabeth always wants to control everything. She needs to learn to deal with problems on her own from time to time." "But canceling her plane ticket was too much," he replied in a low voice. "Please," Diane said firmly. "She has money. She could have taken another flight if she really wanted to come." Amanda sighed. "I sent her a message, but she hasn't replied. She's probably still angry." The four of them went out to the arrivals hall and began looking for their transport. James frowned and looked around. How strange. It should be here. He checked his phone again. "The service is called Paris Elite Transfer, right?" "Yes, that's what Elizabeth confirmed," Amanda said, looking at her husband's screen. 30 minutes passed, and the transport didn't appear. Robert, exhausted, sat down on a nearby bench. "James, why don't you call the company?" suggested Diane, unable to hide her irritation. James dialed the number. "Bonjour, this is Paris Elite Transfer." He paused before continuing. "I'd like to confirm a reservation for the Morgan family." His expression gradually changed. "Cancelled." The rest of the family looked at him expectantly as he nodded slowly. "I understand. Thank you." He hung up and turned around with a bewildered look. The reservation was cancelled yesterday on the instructions of the person who made it. "What?" Diane's voice rose an octave. "Elizabeth? Why would she do something like that?" "Anyway, let's take a taxi," Robert said calmly. "We'll sort this out at the hotel." With their large suitcases, the group headed to the taxi rank and into the city. The Parisian landscape paraded through the windows as the silhouette of the Eiffel Tower began to appear in the distance. Finally, the taxi stopped in front of a luxury hotel in the exclusive first arrondissement. Royal Monceau, Paris. James checked the name in Elizabeth's email and nodded. "This is it. We have a reservation for 5 nights. The group got out of the taxi and gazed at the elegant facade of the hotel. Despite their tiredness, the excitement of staying in a luxurious Parisian hotel began to set in. "Bonjour." A young receptionist greeted them with a smile. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," James replied, stepping forward. "Morgan family. We have a reservation for 5 nights." The receptionist started typing on the computer. Her expression changed subtly. "I'm sorry, but I can't find any reservation in your name. Could you check again?" "Morgan," insisted Diane, approaching the counter with evident anxiety. "I'm sure it's confirmed." The receptionist checked the screen again. There had been a reservation in the name of Morgan, but it had been cancelled. "What?" the four exclaimed in unison. "Yes, it was cancelled yesterday on the instructions of Elizabeth Morgan, the person who made it." Diane's face turned pale. "This must be a mistake. We're staying in Paris for 5 days. Where are we supposed to stay?" The receptionist shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, but the hotel is fully booked. I recommend you look for other accommodation." Staggering with confusion and fatigue, the group returned to the hotel lobby. Robert took out his phone. "Let's find another hotel. There must be good options nearby." Amanda looked worried. "It's high season in Paris. Everything might be full." James took out his computer and opened a booking website. "There are some options here, a bit expensive, but..." He took out his credit card and entered the information. "This is strange." He frowned. "It's not going through." "Use mine," offered Diane, but the result was the same. "Let me try mine," said Robert. His was also rejected. "What the hell is going on?" Diane was starting to panic. "None of our cards are working." Amanda took out her cell phone and opened her banking app. "Mom, my account. My balance is 0. The other 3 checked theirs." "It can't be," Robert whispered. The funds from all their accounts had disappeared. "This is Elizabeth's doing?" James asked incredulously. Robert sighed deeply. She had access to all the accounts. We entrusted her with the family's financial management. Amanda was on the verge of tears. I can't believe she did this. Diane, with a face between anger and fear, murmured. She's gone crazy. This is revenge. James tried to access the shared cloud from his phone. How strange. I can't access the photos. Amanda tried to. Me neither. Everything's disappeared. At that moment, the 4 phones rang with an email notification. The sender, Elizabeth Morgan. Robert opened it and read aloud. Dear family, what happened at Atlanta Airport was the last straw. 4 years I have dedicated myself to serving, planning, and paying for this family. And what have I received in return? Contempt and betrayal. Now you are experiencing the same thing you put me through. No reservations, no money, feeling abandoned. This is the price for leaving me behind. Elizabeth. Silence enveloped the 4 of them. Robert held his head in his hands. Amanda burst into tears. James sat stunned, and Diane, for the first time, found no words. What? What are we going to do? Amanda sobbed. We have no money, no hotel. Let me go to the embassy, Robert proposed. Maybe they can help us. Diane looked confused by the conversations in French around her. She had always relied on Elizabeth to translate. Let's go to the police, James said firmly. This is a crime. Elizabeth stole our money. The police. Diane's voice trembled. But she's my daughter. And what she says has some truth to it. The other 3 looked at her in surprise. Mom, it was you who suggested leaving my sister behind, Amanda accused. I know, Diane shouted. But I never thought it would come to this. Robert spoke softly. We hurt her deeply for many years. The 4 fell silent, lost in the hotel lobby. The beautiful Parisian morning light filtered through the windows, making the contrast with their situation feel even more bitter. Anyway, let's go to the embassy, Robert insisted. From there we'll see what to do. They left the hotel, dragging their heavy suitcases. The streets of Paris were full of life, but the faces of the Morgan family reflected anxiety, regret, and despair. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Elizabeth calmly drank her coffee as she looked at her laptop screen. Reflected on the screen were the transaction histories of her family's credit cards and bank accounts. All refunds for the trip expenses had been deposited into her personal account. Not bad for my first solo trip, she murmured to herself. Sitting on the balcony of a beachfront hotel in Miami, Elizabeth contemplated the gentle waves of the Atlantic. Beside her, a glass of fresh orange juice and a croissant completed the scene. She had chosen a destination completely opposite to Paris, right where her family was stranded. Okay, next step, Elizabeth whispered. She clicked a few times and opened her social media account. She normally didn't use it much, but today was different. She reviewed the posts she had prepared. She took a deep breath and pressed the publish button. Important announcement about my family relationship. For years, I have been responsible for planning, organizing, and paying for family events and trips. This trip to Europe was no exception. However, at Atlanta Airport, I discovered that my family had not made a reservation for me. My mother told me, we only booked for family members. My sister mockingly said, maybe you can follow us on a cheap bus. My father just remained silent. This is the reward for years of dedication. Now they have realized that all the reservations I made in Paris have been cancelled. Sometimes in life, you have to learn the consequences of your actions. The post included an audio file, a secret recording of the exchange at the airport. Elizabeth never shared private matters on social media, but this time was different. This was not just revenge. It was putting an end to years of mistreatment. Within minutes, comments and reactions started pouring in. Messages of surprise and support flooded her inbox. Then Elizabeth accessed the airline's website. She checked her family's return flight information and canceled all the tickets. The refunds, of course, would go to her account. Done. Elizabeth smiled with satisfaction. A necessary lesson, she murmured to herself with no regrets. For years, her family had taken her contributions for granted. Perhaps this was extreme, but it was a lesson they needed to learn. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Morgan family was stranded in a small waiting room inside the U.S. Embassy. Somehow they had managed to get there and were explaining their situation. So your daughter canceled all the reservations as revenge and withdrew the money from your accounts? The embassy official, Mr. Johnson, asked for confirmation. That's correct, Diane replied wearily. We heard her. We can provide you with an emergency fund for the trip, but the amount will be limited, Johnson explained. We can also help you arrange a return flight, but it won't be for another 3 days. 3 days. Amanda wiped away her tears. And where are we supposed to stay? At that moment, James's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and his face turned pale. What's wrong? Amanda asked anxiously. It's my parents, James said with concern. They saw Elizabeth's post on social media. It seems everyone knows. Diane froze. Social media? What did she write? James read the post aloud. When he finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Even a recording, Diane whispered, barely audible. Amanda's phone also started ringing. Messages from friends arrived one after another. Everyone's talking about us, Amanda sobbed. My God, what horrible things we did to my sister. Robert looked silently out the window, his eyes reflecting sadness and regret. We should go to the police, James insisted. What Elizabeth did is illegal. She stole our money. No, Diane said suddenly in a firm tone. We're not going to do that. The other three looked at her in surprise. We were wrong. Elizabeth is right about everything she said. We took her for granted. We never valued everything she did for us, and in the end we left her behind. Amanda took out her cell phone, her hands shaking, trying to write a message. What am I supposed to say? She asked between tears. I'm sorry isn't enough. Tell her the truth, Robert said softly. A sincere apology. Diane took her own phone and took a deep breath. She stared at the screen for a long time before finally starting to write. Elizabeth, it's Mom. I sincerely apologize for everything I've done to you, for leaving you behind at the airport, for belittling everything you've done for us all these years, for favoring Amanda. I've made selfish decisions without considering your feelings, and I hurt you. Now we're lost in Paris, but we deserve it. I know we have no right to ask for your help. A new beginning. But if you give us the chance to talk, I want to build a different relationship in the future. I'm so very sorry. Diane. Diane sent the message and silently began to cry. In Miami, Elizabeth read her mother's email again and again, taking her time to process it. She still felt anger and pain in her heart, but there was something in Diane's words, something that had never been there before. Genuine honesty. After thinking for a moment, she began to write her reply. Mom, I read your email. Honestly, I still feel anger and sadness. For years, I wasn't recognized as part of the family, but as a mirror. My contributions were minimized, my feelings always left in the background. What happened at the airport was just the tip of the iceberg. It's the result of years of patterns that never changed. My actions may seem extreme, but they were the only way I could express the despair and rage I felt. If you are truly sorry, I'm willing to talk, but you must understand that our relationship will be different from now on. I will never again allow myself to be treated as anything less. What I ask is simple. That my efforts be recognized and respected, that there be equality for everyone in the family, that my boundaries be respected. I know you are in trouble in Paris, but before I help, I want to make my conditions clear. When you return, I want us to participate in family therapy and to seriously talk about our future relationship. If you accept this, I will send you the necessary money and rebook your return flight. Elizabeth finished writing and exhaled deeply before pressing send. This could be a new beginning or a final goodbye. Either way, she was determined to defend her worth. A few minutes later, she received Diane's reply. It was short but clear. Elizabeth, I accept all your conditions. We are going to change. I promise you. Thank you. Elizabeth smiled calmly. She opened her computer and began transferring the emergency funds for her family. Then she booked the plane tickets, this time for 5 people. Still, she decided to continue her solo trip in Miami, just as she had planned. She needed this time for herself. Facing her family after their return would be another challenge, but this time, things would be different. 8 months later, in a small cafe in the suburbs of Atlanta, Elizabeth held her coffee cup with both hands as she watched the autumn leaves fall through the window. 8 months had passed since that incident in Paris. Her expression reflected confidence and tranquility, something she didn't have before. She turned around, hearing footsteps, and saw her mother, Diane, approaching. Her eyes reflected warmth and a bit of nervousness. There was no trace of the arrogance of before. "Mom, I thought you'd be late," Elizabeth said, standing up. Diane smiled and hugged her gently. "Therapy went a bit long," she replied as she sat down. "But we had a very good conversation today." Elizabeth nodded silently. After what happened in Paris, the whole family had started group therapy just as they promised. Diane, in particular, had also taken individual sessions to understand her own behavior patterns. Elizabeth's cell phone vibrated with a message from Amanda. She checked it and smiled. "What's up?" Diane asked. "Dad and Amanda are preparing dinner." Diane let out a soft laugh. "I can't believe Amanda is cooking. A new beginning." "She's changed too," Elizabeth said softly. Since that incident, family dynamics had changed drastically. The first few weeks were full of tension and discomfort, but with therapy and honest dialogue, a new relationship gradually formed. For the first time, Amanda acknowledged the impact of her words and actions, and was making a real effort to rebuild her relationship with her sister. James also began to understand Elizabeth better, and finally respected her as a valuable member of the family. But above all, Robert broke years of silence and began to actively express his opinion within the family. "How are the plans for next month's family trip coming along?" Diane asked. Elizabeth smiled. "They're going well. Everyone is cooperating, so this time it's very pleasant." For the first time, the organization of the trip did not fall entirely on Elizabeth's shoulders. Now the whole family shared responsibilities. Robert was in charge of transportation, Amanda and James of accommodation. Diane planned the activities, and Elizabeth coordinated everything. In addition, expenses were divided fairly. Suddenly, Diane spoke in a more serious tone. "I still think about that day sometimes. The day we left you behind at the airport. I'm so sorry." Elizabeth put her hand on her mother's and looked at her tenderly. "That's in the past now, Mom. The important thing is what we've learned from it." Diane smiled, her eyes filling with tears. "You were a strong girl, and I just didn't see it." The two drank their coffee in silence for a moment, each immersed in their thoughts. Suddenly, Diane changed the subject. "By the way, how's your new job going?" Elizabeth's face lit up. "Very well. It's a job where I can really use my skills, and my colleagues are wonderful." After the incident in Paris, Elizabeth made a big decision. She left the accounting firm where she had worked for years and became an independent travel planning consultant, following her true passion. Her organizational skills and attention to detail were highly valued in her new career. "Maybe it was that incident that gave me the courage to recognize my own worth," she said softly. As they left the cafe, dusk gently covered the city. While they walked to the car, they talked about the upcoming family dinner. Upon arriving at Elizabeth's house, Robert waited for them at the entrance with a warm smile. "Welcome back," he said, hugging his daughter. "Amanda is making a mess in the kitchen. Could you help her?" From inside the house, Amanda's voice and James's laughter could be heard. Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling enveloped in a comforting warmth. This was the family she had always wanted. Not perfect, but a family that respected and loved each other. "Let's go," she said with a smile. "I'm sure they need help." The door opened and a warm light, along with the sound of laughter, welcomed her. Elizabeth paused for a moment, etching that moment in her heart. She thought about how sometimes life takes us down unexpected paths to lead us right to the place we truly long for. The painful separation at the airport had actually been the gateway to a new beginning.